Bartimaeus, The Ring of Solomon, written by Jonathan Stroud, is an alternate history fantasy novel set in a version of Earth where demons are real and humans bargain with them for wealth and power all too often. The most notable stylistic choice Stroud makes in the Bartimaeus series is writing as though it were an historical account being written by various characters' perspectives, most commonly that of Bartimaeus himself, but with occasional input by other main characters. In each chapter, the supposed author is noted at the top of each page, giving the reader an indication as to who is speaking. As such, the use of first-person past tense remains consistent throughout the novel, even though the person being referred to may be prone to change between chapters. In order to reinforce the idea of the novel being an historical account of this fictional Earth, Stroud makes use of in-text footnotes in much the same way one might do in an historical essay. These are implied to be personal notes from the character currently in focus, and as such, they tend to contain a combination of both personal comments by the character as well as important information about the narrative. By separating these footnotes from the rest of the main body, Stroud achieves two important things. Firstly, by imitating the formatting of non-fiction writing, it sells the idea that this story is being penned by someone in the world, rather than the fictional narrative written by Stroud himself. More importantly, however, Stroud uses this stylistic choice to modulate the reader's point of view, and present background information in a way that doesn't interrupt the flow of the scene. One issue that every fiction writer has to overcome is bringing the reader into their setting. This is difficult enough in narratives that are already close to reality, but trying to construct entire new worlds with new rules and new ideas means there are so many more steps in that process, so much more for the reader to ingest. For example, in J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, the reader would be completely lost if they assumed the One Ring to be a simple trinket. There are so many new ideas the reader must digest before they can understand all the details of a fantasy world. It can be difficult to communicate these ideas in a way that feels natural to the reader. And as writers, we can struggle to avoid writing long-winded, out-of-context explanations that break the flow of narrative. We also risk having characters explain things that should be completely common knowledge to them, making exposition seem unnaturally stiff and forced. The use of footnotes in creative fiction gives more freedom to the author by allowing them to determine the relevance of information and how the reader should perceive it. These are often details and expository elements that could be neglected entirely, but would add much needed depth to the world. By having these details sequestered at the bottom of the page, as opposed to being included in the main body, it allows the story to flow in a natural way, while ensuring the reader is privy to the same amount of information as characters in the scene. Not only that, but it means the reader is free to take in as much or as little of the scene as they wish, before getting the providing context, meaning the action doesn't have to slow down for the reader to catch up. Crucially, almost all of Stroud's footnotes are not essential to the story, and could even be ignored by the reader if so desired. After analyzing Stroud's use of this stylistic technique, I have identified three main purposes that it serves in his writing. The first is to provide definitions for words and phrases that would be available knowledge to characters in the novel, but would be foreign concepts to anyone reading. In this example, Stroud describes the initial meeting between Bartimaeus and Asmira, one of the other protagonists we've been following up until now. Given that this is the first mention of the term first injunction throughout the novel, the reader isn't given any other context for what this phrase means up until this point. If the meaning were explained just after this main body quote, it would interrupt the preceding dialogue, and as such lower the tension of the scene. Explaining it once the dialogue was finished, however, would leave the reader confused for several sentences while they waited for context. By taking arcane terms that exist only in the fictional narrative and separating them from the body, it allows the author to break the fourth wall and catch the reader up to speed with what they should know. This gives an opportunity for the reader to immerse themselves further in the world by giving them information they would be privy to as it were relevant in the story. In a similar sense, footnotes can also be used to provide context for locations or historical events that occur in the narrative, common knowledge that exists on a larger scale. Since the Bartimaeus series exists in a parallel version of Earth, Stroud primarily uses this to describe the ways in which his world diverges from the Earth we know as readers. In this example, Bartimaeus is receiving instructions from his summoner, Kaba, as to the whereabouts of Eridu, a lost city supposedly filled with untouched treasures. This excerpt is taken from the first chapter, where one would typically expect a call to action to take place, but Bartimaeus surprises Kaba by stating simply that he already knows where he has to go. Ordinarily, one might expect the first portion of this quote to do the heavy lifting, as it already gives the reader enough context to imagine the journey, and it is easiest to have the protagonist learn as the reader does. Stroud's use of footnotes, however, gives insight into the knowledge of Bartimaeus in a way that doesn't feel redundant or heavy-handed. In addition, while the reader is a place in the real world, this footnote gives important context as to how it differs from its real-world counterpart. Finally, Stroud uses these footnotes as a way of providing his protagonists an opportunity to interact with the reader directly. This comes across as both an opportunity for the writer to break the fourth wall, as well as fairly frequent moments of an unreliable narrator. As these notes are technically designed to be written by the characters themselves after the events of the story, there are many instances in which they give insight or make comments that might not be entirely appropriate for the scene at hand, but do still make for good examples of the character's personality and knowledge. Bartimaeus, for example, is a deeply sardonic and unruly character, and as such will often speak with a complete lack of respect for his masters. In this example, Stroud illustrates this by having Bartimaeus plead his case to Solomon after being reprimanded for sloppy workmanship, with an improper metaphor slipped in. In the footnote, however, he chooses to focus on this break in protocol, speaking fondly about the kinds of crude language used often by demons of this age. These comments will sometimes be made to look like one of the previous two types of footnotes, just as this one is made to look like an explanation of a technical term. Similarly, more informative footnotes will employ personal anecdotes or characteristics of the supposed author, but it's fairly common for notes such as this one to add nothing to the story beyond an opportunity for the character to express themselves. They will often speak to the reader directly, making judgments about the events unfolding in the story, amending details as they perceive them, and providing some much-needed levity to the story at hand. I have taken inspiration from Stroud's work in order to write a piece of my own. By analyzing the ways in which he uses this technique, I've attempted to amplify my own writing by using footnotes to add additional details where I feel they are needed. While Stroud uses this technique to alleviate common problems present in the fantasy genre, I have taken a similar approach by applying it to a piece of science fiction literature. There are many common issues that present themselves when writing in the fantasy genre that can also emerge in many other genres, particularly science fiction. The first is in defining technical language. Science fiction especially makes use of this, as it requires the author to not only consider but extrapolate on modern science practices, hazarding a guess as to what technology might look like centuries in the future. Providing the requisite information required for the reader to understand can be a difficult task to manage. By informing the reader as needed, the connection to reality is strengthened as the author adds a sense of legitimacy to the piece, without bogging it down with unnecessary verbosity. Secondly, it can help to add additional breadth to the world and the cultures in it. While most genres will reserve themselves to a relatively small setting, making this use comparably less important, science fiction often makes use of space travel in a way that expands the scope beyond what most stories would need to use. This leaves an awful lot of implied history and locations that are typically unknown to the reader, and yet may seem unnatural if characters in the setting were to talk about such common knowledge at length. Finally, using a character's own writings to communicate their traits is not only a useful tool in all forms of writing, but it is a tried and tested approach in the science fiction genre, as famously demonstrated by the use of personal logs in titles such as Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. It makes sense that extensive written records would be present in a setting that exceeds modern technology, and as such, it is easy to justify characters having records of their travels. This story begins with the protagonist, who we will later learn is named Arsha, finding his ship under attack by a much larger vessel. In these opening sentences, the focus is kept mainly on the thoughts and emotions of Arsha, as well as the events most immediately obvious to his senses. Due to the nature of this scene, it's imperative to keep the perspective light and the action quick, to simulate the danger of the situation. In this first footnote, however, I've taken the opportunity to give some initial foreshadowing as to Arsha's true intentions. This gives us a sense that he isn't just cowardly, but has connections to somebody that he shouldn't. Next, I've provided a little more detail as to what the term Huntress class actually means. If I were to use a different style, I may have left this information far later in the story, but instead I've allowed the reader to decide the importance of this information and if or when they care to know. Finally, I've used this third footnote to give some details into another character, but through the lens of the supposed author. While it could be assumed that Finnegan is simply a loud character, this statement also suggests that Arsha may be the reason she is constantly shouting. In this next paragraph, we're given a little more insight into Arsha's role on the ship, as well as some information about the ship itself. This occurs roughly halfway through the firefight, during a brief moment of reprieve where Arsha has a chance to think, which represents a good opportunity to give context and exposition, as well as an opportunity to zoom out somewhat from Arsha's immediate perspective. Though I have attempted to keep this moment fairly succinct, I use the opportunity to further expand on the knowledge being presented. Here we are given an idea of what type of ship the Corsair is. Though it would have been easy to imagine the ship as outgunned, this further cements how slim its odds are compared to the Artemis. I've also slipped in a sarcastic comment from Arsha at the end, trying to give more of an idea of what sort of person he is. Once again, I've taken the opportunity to define some technical language, as this is perhaps crucial to do in the early stages of a story as compared to later, when readers are likely to understand the world better. This kind of anecdote is also a good opportunity for future plot points, as establishing the danger of such a device early allows it to be used elegantly later on. Lastly, this paragraph appears near the end of the fight, where Arsha follows through with his inevitable betrayal. Once again, I've kept the focus tightly on sensations and thoughts, even having the dialogue occur directly in Arsha's own ear. I have also given a rough idea of Arsha's age, as well as some limited detail about his disability. I take the opportunity to expand on the two main character details mentioned in the body text, as I feel they have enough importance for a reader to want to know more. The main text doesn't explicitly imply his deafness, and it might otherwise be a long time before there's an opportunity to elaborate on what he means by his good ear. This insight also expands out into the world beyond this current scene, though the focus is primarily on Asha's role in that world. In this final note, I've taken an opportunity to focus on Asha's character and internal thoughts, giving some more depth to this interaction. Once again, I've tried to hint at the rocky relationship between Asha and his captain, as well as beginning to explain some of the reasons why he is so quick to abandon ship.